Alright, so when AMD came to me and started talking about the 9850X3D, I didn't know what to think about it, right? I didn't know if it was some sort of like PR stunt in order to get their name into the news cycle once again, or if this new CPU would actually provide like a bona fide new product for gamers. Now that we know where everything is, I need to talk to you about this thing because look, compared to the current 9800X3D, there are some interesting things going on here, but there are also a whole slew of problems too. I mean, on the surface of things, we aren't talking about much here. A $30 premium gets you the same amount of cache and an identical base frequency along with a 400 megahertz higher boost speed. That'll happen at opportune times. But the gap between it and the standard 9800X3D chips might not be quite as large as AMD wants you to believe. And as they say, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? Because in order to get to this point, in order to create this chip, AMD had to make a bunch of sacrifices too. Namely, there's ballooning power needs and much higher temperatures when gaming. So to talk a little bit more about those, I need to set the stage here a bit. In purely single thread benchmarks, the 9850X3D can hit its 400 megahertz of additional frequency headroom pretty easily compared to the 3 regular 9800X3Ds we have in the lab right now. As a result, its 1T score shoots upwards by about 10%. On the other hand, its frequency is barely any different in heavy multi-threaded situations, about 50 megahertz give or take in a best case scenario. So its performance ends up being a bit higher, but not by all that much, and well within a margin of error. So for intensive tasks, you won't see any difference in real-world apps. On the other hand, power stayed pretty close to the original with slight variance that seems to fall into normal thresholds. Temperatures under full core workloads look pretty normal too, but check out what happens when gaming. When we look at average CPU power consumption across all 10 games we benchmarked, the 9850X3D guzzles back much more juice, sometimes up to 30 watts. So obviously to hit a bit higher clocks at certain load levels, they're needing exponentially more power. And guess what that leads to? Yup, a correspondingly huge increase in temperatures too. While you could literally use a low profile cooler to keep the 9800X3D under 80 degrees during gaming workloads, the 9850X3D poses a completely different challenge. And make no mistake about it, that's a huge new hurdle to overcome for people building systems with the newest X3D processor. The old one was infinitely more adaptable, whereas now you might need to pay more for a better cooler, or avoid it altogether if you're putting together a small form factor gaming system with height limited heatsink options. So basically this thing is a slightly massaged 9800X3D that's been binned in order to hit higher speeds. And to do that, it needs to consume a lot more power and produce more heat than a standard 9800X3D. But look, gamers, historically, they've been willing to push those two elements aside if that CPU will give them substantially better performance. But is that something that this thing can actually provide? To find out, we tested with an RTX 5090 in 2 ways. At 1080p with low to medium settings for the processors to stretch their legs. But that, of course, is a completely unrealistic metric for people who want to know how a CPU affects frame rates with the settings that they actually use. So for that, we're comparing and contrasting with 1440p at the absolute highest possible settings. The CPUs being covered are pretty straightforward. All the 800 series X3D processors running all the way back to the OG 5800X3D, along with Intel's 2 highest end processors from the last few years. I'm also including the 9950X3D both with and without the motherboard's turbo mode enabled, which disables the CCD without the 3D V cache. Starting off with Alan Wake, and let me make one thing clear right away. At 1440p with the highest possible settings, we'll be smashing into a GPU limitation again and again in almost all of our benchmarks. So I'll be focusing on 1080p low medium since that's where all the action happens, even in a traditionally GPU limited game like this one. And here the 9850X3D gets narrowly beaten by the 9950X3D in its turbo mode, and it doesn't offer any noticeable benefits over the standard version, though there is a small increase in 1% lows. Arc Raiders shows an even more level playing field without any discernible difference between the processors. going all the way back to the 7800X3D. The only CPUs that sort of start falling off a bit are the 5800X3D and the 1% lows for both Intel CPUs. It's more of the same with Battlefield, with the two 9800s being tied, though this is one game where turbo mode actually negatively impacts the 9950X3D's 1% lows, in a pretty big way too. One thing is abundantly clear too: Intel needs a freaking miracle to catch up with AMD in most games, but not in Black Myth, where Intel has one of their rare wins at 1080p low, while the two 9800s are neck and neck, proving there's plenty of games that really don't benefit from CPU clocks or 3D V cache. Baldur's Gate, on the other hand, well, this one loves big core counts, higher frequencies, and more cache. So all the X3Ds completely run away with things. This is also the first time we're seeing the 9850 X3D make a bit bigger impact, with a 10% increase in 1% lows over the standard 9800 X3D at both resolutions. But nothing, and I mean nothing, comes close to the 9950 X3D in this test. It's just the runaway champ here. And that big boy X3D chip does the exact same thing in CS2. And this is also an area where the 9850 X3D starts to pull a bit further ahead too, even at 1440p. It's interesting though, isn't it? Counter-Strike used to be dominated by Intel, but now their latest processors are barely any better than a 5800 X3D. Something else I need to address is the oddly low 99th percentile frame times at 1080p. This seems to be a hiccup in the last few game updates for CS2. Basically, to get the smoothest experience, believe it or not, you have to play at higher detail settings, at least until Valve patches this. And Cyberpunk, well, it goes right back to a flat line at 1440p, with the 5800 X3D and two Intel CPUs being the only ones here that underperform by quite a bit in their 1% lows. But I also need to put this into a bit of context, because it's the game engine itself which limits top-end 99th percentile frame times here. Even then, the 9850 X3D makes a negligible impact even at 1080p low. And while Space Marine is a very graphics heavy game, higher end X3D processors are hugely beneficial here, and even the 9850 X3D makes some notable inroads over the standard version. If you're looking to upgrade from a 5800 X3D, then all of these CPUs will provide substantial benefits. But the best of the best is, once again, that ultra expensive 9950 X3D with the motherboard's turbo mode enabled. And look, yes, there are situations where the new X3D chip can absolutely shine, but its frequency increase isn't going to lead to any miracles here, guys, especially at resolutions and settings that most people play at. We need to sort of like rig the results by running reduced settings at 1080p for there to be any difference whatsoever. And even when we do that, there's still plenty of games like Warhammer 2 Total War that just don't see any difference whatsoever, which makes the 9850 X3D kind of pointless. I mean, sure, we can work all day, every day in order to try to make the 9850 X3D look as good as possible by using very specific games at very specific settings. But let's be completely honest here, right? What we have is only a 400 megahertz increase to the boost clock with no associated increase to the base clock. So what we're getting here across the range are like infinitesimal increases in performance, so little that they really don't even matter in my opinion. Plus, this is something you could have already done with the original 9800 X3D and a bit of manual tuning. I mean, we tried our best, even by using settings you'd never use a high-end system to game with, and the result was on average about 3.5% better performance for the 9850 X3D over the previous generation CPU. And is this thing really worth the additional power consumption and price? Personally, I don't think that those results make it worthwhile at all, especially when you couple it with the fact that it's so much harder to cool. I mean, that previous generation 9800, actually, sorry, what I'm calling a previous generation, but it's a current generation, 9800 X3D could have been cooled with like a potato in an SFF build. Now you're looking at something that's a hell of a lot less adaptable, and that's a problem for me. I mean, on the positive side, it's not like AMD's charging a huge amount more for the 9850 X3D, but I can't help but feel that 30 bucks or maybe a little bit more could be better spent elsewhere on a build, like absorbing the insane memory prices right now if you're building a brand new system or upgrading from a DDR3 or DDR4 platform. Basically, all they're doing here is binning the same chips, just a little bit more carefully carefully, and they're charging a premium for it. So basically, I don't think AMD's mission here was to move forward the goalposts in any meaningful way. There isn't really anything new here for gamers. There isn't anything that is like a must buy. You're paying $30 more and sacrificing on the power and especially on the temperature end. And for me, this is more about this being maybe a PR stunt in some ways in order to get AMD's name back into the news when Panther Lake is suddenly pooping all over them on the laptop side. And to me, that makes the 9850 X3D unfortunately very, very hard to recommend. So anyways, I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day, guys.